Why did a woman who could read ancient Greek have to pretend she didn't understand finance? How many times did a queen, fluent in multiple languages, have to listen to a monolingual man explain foreign policy to her? What happens to a country when its most capable mind is forced to defer to less intelligent men simply because of her gender? And history is filled with these quiet tragedies. We see the crowns and the castles, but we often miss the story of a brilliant woman sitting in a room of powerful men, knowing she's the smartest person there, but having to hide it to survive. Number 17 was Eleanor of Aquitaine, too smart for her own good. She was one of the wealthiest women in Europe at age 15. She led her own soldiers on the Second Crusade. She outlived 8 of her 10 children. But Eleanor of Aquitaine's real power was her mind. Her education was exceptional. In the 12th century, most nobles, especially men, were barely literate. They were trained for fighting, not thinking. Eleanor, however, was raised in Aquitaine, a center of culture and learning. She learned Latin, the language of law and the church. She was fluent in her native Poitevin dialect and familiar with other Romance languages. And she studied music and literature. She understood arithmetic, which was crucial for managing the vast estates she inherited. Her first husband was King Louis VII of France. Louis was a pious, simple man. He was raised for the church, not the throne. He became king only after his older brother died unexpectedly. He was quiet and indecisive. Eleanor, on the other hand, was vibrant, intelligent, and politically astute. She found the French court dull and restrictive. The men there were warriors, not scholars or poets. They could not hold a conversation with her on the topics that interested her. She was intellectually isolated. This mismatch was obvious during the Second Crusade. Eleanor insisted on going not as a passive queen, but as the feudal leader of her Aquitanian vassals. She brought her own knights and supplies. Louis and his advisors were horrified. They saw it as inappropriate. During the Long March, her strategic advice was often better than that of the French generals. She understood logistics and local politics. They ignored her. The crusade was a disaster, partly because the male leaders made a series of tactical blunders. Her second husband, Henry II of England, was a better match at first. He was energetic and intelligent, but he was also ruthless and controlling. He recognized her intelligence, but also saw it as a threat. Eleanor was not content to be just a mother to his heirs. She was an active political partner. She governed England as regent when Henry was away. She managed her own lands in Aquitaine. She understood law and administration better than many of his barons. But when her sons grew up, they rebelled against their father. Henry believed Eleanor encouraged them. He saw her sharp mind and political skill as the engine behind the rebellion. So what did he do? He imprisoned her. For 16 years, one of the most brilliant political minds in Europe was kept under house arrest. The men who ruled in her place were arguably less competent. They lacked her deep understanding of feudal law and her diplomatic skills. Henry II spent the rest of his reign fighting his own sons, a conflict that might have been avoided or managed by Eleanor's counsel. When Henry died, her son Richard the Lionheart immediately freed her. He was a great warrior, but not a great administrator. He promptly left for the Third Crusade. And who did he leave in charge of England? His mother, Eleanor. She was in her late 60s. She governed England, raised Richard's enormous ransom when he was captured, and put down a rebellion by her other son, John. The men around her, including John, were focused on their own power grabs. Eleanor was focused on keeping the kingdom stable. She used her intelligence not for personal gain, but for the good of the realm. She proved she was not just smarter, but a far more capable ruler than the men who had tried to sideline her. Number 16, did Jadwiga of Poland marry a man or a kingdom? She was crowned king, not queen, at the age of 10. She spoke at least 5 languages. She founded a university that is still one of Europe's best. Jadwiga of Poland was not a typical medieval monarch. In 1384, the Polish nobles demanded their young ruler come to Poland, but they refused to accept her betrothed, William of Habsburg. They had a different plan. They wanted her to marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Lithuania was the last pagan state in Europe. A marriage would create a powerful Polish-Lithuanian union and convert Lithuania to Christianity. Jadwiga was a young girl in love with William, but she was also exceptionally well educated for her time. She had been tutored in languages, theology, and governance. She could read and write in Latin, Polish, Hungarian, German, and likely French. Jogaila, the man she was being forced to marry, was by all accounts uneducated. He was a pagan ruler from a land considered barbaric by Christian Europe. He was illiterate. He knew nothing of the courtly culture, theology, or philosophy that Jadwiga had grown up with. The men around her, the Polish magnates, saw only the political benefits. They didn't care about the intellectual or personal sacrifice she had to make. They needed her to secure the border and expand their influence. They were pragmatic men, warriors, and landowners, not scholars. They likely saw her education as a charming, but ultimately useless feminine accomplishment. Jadwiga made a choice that demonstrated an intelligence far beyond her years. She understood the geopolitical situation better than many of the older nobles. She saw the long-term benefit of a united Poland and Lithuania. She gave up her personal happiness for the sake of her country. She agreed to marry Jogaila. It was a decision rooted in logic and duty, not emotion. Once married, she did not fade into the background. She became the intellectual and moral center of the court. While her husband, who took the name Ladislaw II Jagiello, learned the basics of Christian kingship, Jadwiga was the one driving cultural and educational progress. She used her own personal jewelry and wealth to restore and fund the University of Krakow in 1397. It was her vision that turned it into a major center of learning. The men of her court were focused on war with the Teutonic Knights. She was focused on building an institution that would educate generations of Polish leaders. She was also an active diplomat. She could negotiate in Latin with representatives of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. She met with the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights to negotiate peace. Her husband and his Lithuanian nobles were new to this world of complex European diplomacy. They were soldiers. Jadwiga was a stateswoman. She understood the nuances of treaties and the importance of alliances. She died at the age of 25. But in her short reign, she fundamentally changed the course of Eastern European history. She did it by using her intellect. The men around her had military power and feudal authority, but Jadwiga had knowledge. She understood that a kingdom's true strength came not just from its army, but from its universities, its laws, and its place in the wider world. It was a lesson many of the powerful men of her time never learned. Number 15. Could Queen Zenobia have remade the Roman Empire? She claimed descent from Cleopatra. She could ride, hunt, and march with her soldiers. She spoke at least 4 languages fluently: Aramaic, Egyptian, Greek, and Latin. Zenobia, the 3rd century queen of the Palmyrene Empire, was a force of nature. In an era when the Roman Empire was in chaos, she carved out her own empire from its eastern provinces. Zenobia's husband was Odenathus, the ruler of Palmyra, a wealthy city on the trade routes connecting Rome and Persia. He was a skilled general and a Roman ally. While he was a capable military man, Zenobia was the intellectual powerhouse of the court. She was deeply educated in Greek philosophy and history. Her court was filled with scholars, including the famous philosopher Cassius Longinus. She studied the histories of Alexander the Great and imagined an empire of her own. The Roman officials and generals she dealt with were often brutish soldiers who had seized power in a coup. They were concerned with short-term survival and plunder. Zenobia was thinking bigger. She was thinking about legacy. When her husband was assassinated, Zenobia took power as regent for her young son. But she was the one in charge. She immediately began to expand her territory. She conquered Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, in 269 AD. And then she took Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. At its height, her empire stretched from Egypt to Ankara. She was ruling a huge portion of the Roman world. Her administration was far more efficient and stable than that of the Roman emperors of the time. The period was known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. Rome had dozens of emperors in a few decades, most of whom were assassinated. The economy was collapsing. The borders were under constant threat. In contrast, Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire was well governed. She maintained the trade routes, minted her own currency, and practiced religious tolerance. She was a better administrator than the men in Rome who claimed to be her superiors. She understood economics, logistics, and governance on a level they could not match. Her ultimate downfall came when a competent Roman emperor, Aurelian, finally came to power. Aurelian was a brilliant general, but his goal was simple: reconquer the lost territories. He didn't offer treaties or negotiations based on mutual respect. He saw Zenobia as a rebellious woman who needed to be put in her place. He marched his legions east. Zenobia led her armies personally. She was a skilled strategist, but she was ultimately outmatched by the full might of the Roman military machine. After a series of defeats, Palmyra was besieged and captured in 272 AD. Aurelian took Zenobia back to Rome. He paraded her through the streets in golden chains during his triumph. What happened next is debated. Some say she died on the way to Rome. Others, more credibly, say Aurelian, perhaps impressed by her spirit and intelligence, gave her a villa in Tivoli where she lived out her days. The men who defeated her saw her as an uppity woman. They couldn't comprehend that her vision for a stable, culturally rich Eastern Empire might have actually been better for the region than the chaotic rule of Rome. They defeated her militarily, but they couldn't erase the fact that for a few years, a woman had run a third of their empire more effectively than they had. Number 14. What did Zetian know that her male rivals didn't? She was the only woman in more than 3,000 years of Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou. She ruled for 15 years and dominated the Chinese court for nearly half a century. Zetian's rise to power was stunning, and she did it largely with her brain. She entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a junior concubine when she was just 14 years old. This was not a place for the intellectually timid. The court was a web of intrigue, dominated by powerful male scholar officials and eunuchs. Most women in the Forbidden City were uneducated pawns in a political game. Wu was different. She was literate, which was rare for women of her station. She was a keen observer of court politics. While other women focused on pleasing the emperor, Wu was studying how power worked. Emperor Taizong didn't pay her much attention. He was a military man, a conqueror. He once boasted about his difficult horse, saying no one could tame it. The young Zetian stepped forward and said she could, but she would need 3 things: an iron whip, an iron mace, and a dagger. If the horse didn't submit to the whip, she would use the mace. If it still didn't submit, she would use the dagger. The emperor was not amused by her ruthlessness, but it showed her mindset. She was a problem solver, not a passive observer. After Taizong's death, she managed to return to the palace and capture the heart of his son, Emperor Gaozong. He was a weak and sickly ruler. Wu, on the other hand, was intelligent, decisive, and politically brilliant. She quickly became his most trusted advisor. The male chancellors and ministers of the court were Confucian scholars. They believed women had no place in government. They despised her. They saw her as a manipulative woman who had bewitched the emperor. They consistently underestimated her intellect. This was their biggest mistake. Wu understood policy better than they did. She read the petitions and memorials sent to the throne. She had a deep grasp of military strategy, agriculture, and economics. While the emperor's health failed, she became the de facto ruler of China. The ministers would come to the throne to consult with the emperor, but Wu would be sitting behind a screen, whispering instructions to him. Eventually, they were simply taking orders from her. When Gaozong died, she ruled through her sons, placing them on the throne and then deposing them when they disobeyed her. Finally, in 690 AD, she declared herself Empress Regnant, the founder of the Zhou dynasty. The male Confucian establishment was horrified. This was a complete violation of tradition and cosmic order. To counter their opposition, she used intelligence and propaganda. She circulated stories that she was the reincarnation of a bodhisattva. She recruited talented people from all social classes into her government, bypassing the old aristocratic networks that opposed her. She promoted officials based on merit, not birth. She used a system of secret police to root out her enemies, a brutal but effective method. But her reign was also a time of relative peace and prosperity. She stabilized the empire, expanded its borders, and promoted Buddhism. The men she ruled over were often consumed by factional infighting and adherence to rigid tradition. Wu was a pragmatist. She cared about what worked. She knew that talent was more important than gender or family name. It was a lesson the men she replaced had never been willing to learn. Number 13, why was Sorghaghtani Beki the most important person you've never heard of? She never ruled an empire, she never led an army, yet she was arguably one of the most powerful and intelligent people of the 13th century. Sorghaghtani Beki was a princess of the Karate tribe and the daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan. Her husband was Tului, Genghis's youngest son. He was a gifted general, but also a heavy drinker who died young. He left Sorghaghtani a widow with 4 young sons, Mongke, Kublai, Hulagu, and Arik Boke. In the Mongol Empire, a widow of a powerful man could easily fade into obscurity. The empire was a man's world, built on conquest and military might. The Mongol princes were often illiterate, focused on horsemanship and battle. They were surrounded by male advisors who schemed for power. Sorghaghtani was different. She was a Nestorian Christian in a largely shamanist and Buddhist world. And she was incredibly smart. She recognized that the Mongol Empire could not survive on conquest alone. It needed to be governed. While other Mongol princes were squabbling over loot and territory, Sorghaghtani was learning how to run a state. Her lands in northern China were a model of good governance. She understood that if you exploited the peasants too much, they would rebel or starve, and then there would be no more taxes. So she lowered taxes, promoted agriculture, and gave aid to the poor. She listened to the advice of Chinese Confucian scholars, Muslim administrators, and Christian priests. The male Mongol leaders around her often ruled by brute force. They saw settled peoples as a resource to be plundered. Sorghaghtani saw them as a foundation to be cultivated. Her political intelligence was unmatched. After the death of Ojide Khan, Genghis's son and successor, the Mongol Empire entered a period of political crisis. The regent, Ojide's widow Torajin, tried to promote her own son. Other factions pushed their own candidates. It was a chaotic and dangerous time. Sorghaghtani played the long game. She was patient. She built alliances. She quietly managed her own lands and raised her sons. She made sure they were educated not just as Mongol warriors, but as future rulers of a diverse, multi-ethnic empire. They learned from Chinese, Persian, and European tutors. In 1251, at the Great Mongol Assembly, or Kurultai, her moment came. Through shrewd political maneuvering and a network of alliances she had built over decades, she managed to get her eldest son, Mongke, elected as the Great Khan. It was a stunning victory. She had outmaneuvered all the powerful male princes of the Mongol royal family. They had the armies and the titles. She had the strategy. Her influence didn't stop there. All 4 of her sons became great rulers. Mongke became the Great Khan. Kublai Khan conquered the rest of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. Hulagu Khan conquered Persia and founded the Ilkhanate. Arik Boke was a claimant to the throne of Great Khan. The wives of Genghis Khan's other sons produced no comparable lineage. Sorghaghtani's sons shaped the history of Asia for the next century. A Persian historian of the time wrote, "If I were to see another woman like Sorghaghtani, I would have to say that the female sex is superior to the male." In a world dominated by the most powerful warriors on earth, she proved that intelligence, foresight, and administrative skill were more powerful than a sword. Number 12, did Isabella I of Castile's brains build the Spanish Empire? We often hear about Ferdinand and Isabella, but it's time to be honest. Isabella was the senior partner in that relationship. She was the one with the vision, the intellect, and the iron will. Ferdinand was a cunning politician, but Isabella was a true stateswoman. Her path to the throne was not easy. She lived in a time when women were not supposed to rule. Her own half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile, tried to marry her off to a series of older men to neutralize her as a political threat. But Isabella was highly intelligent and had her own ideas. She had received a good education, learning to read and write Castilian and some Latin. More importantly, she had a powerful analytical mind and a deep understanding of power. She made a bold choice. She defied her brother and chose her own husband, Ferdinand of Aragon. It was a brilliant strategic move. The marriage united the 2 largest kingdoms in Spain, Castile and Aragon, but the marriage contract she negotiated was a work of genius. It ensured that she would retain all her royal authority as Queen of Castile. She would not be just Ferdinand's wife, she would be his equal ruler in her own kingdom. The men who drafted the treaty for Ferdinand were likely surprised by her political and legal acumen. She was a teenage girl dictating terms to a king. Once on the throne, she set about reforming Castile, which was in a state of near anarchy. The male nobles had become overmighty, acting like kings in their own lands. They ran their own private armies and ignored the crown. Isabella, with Ferdinand's help, broke their power. But she did it with more than just force. She did it with administrative intelligence. She established the Santa Hermandad, a national police force that made the roads safe and enforced royal justice. She reorganized the royal council, pushing out the powerful but incompetent nobles and bringing in educated men, letrados, who were loyal to the crown. These men were chosen for their legal training and ability, not their family names. This was a meritocratic idea that was far ahead of its time. Her intellectual curiosity was vast. Even as a busy queen, she made time to improve her Latin. She built a huge library and patronized scholars. She understood that a strong kingdom needed more than just soldiers. It needed educated administrators, lawyers, and diplomats. The most famous event of her reign was the financing of Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492. Ferdinand and his male advisors were skeptical. They saw it as a risky and expensive gamble. The experts at the University of Salamanca had advised against it, arguing Columbus had miscalculated the size of the earth. But Isabella listened to Columbus's arguments. She had an open and inquisitive mind. She saw the potential. She overruled her male advisors and funded the expedition. It was her decision, and it changed the world. It made Spain the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe for over a century. While Ferdinand was often away fighting wars, Isabella was the one running the government. She managed the kingdom's finances, oversaw the legal system, and directed foreign policy. The men around her, from her husband to her bishops and generals, were products of a medieval world of feudal obligations and military honor. And Isabella was building a modern nation state. She used her intelligence to create centralized power, a professional bureaucracy, and a global empire. Ferdinand gets half the credit, but Isabella was the true architect. Number 11. How did Margaret I of Denmark do what no Viking king could? She created the largest state in Europe. She did it without fighting a single major war. And she did it by outthinking every king, noble, and bishop who stood in her way. Margaret I of Denmark is one of the most successful rulers in Scandinavian history, yet she is not as famous as her male counterparts. Perhaps because her weapons were diplomacy, law, and intelligence, not axes and longships, Margaret was born in 1353, the daughter of the King of Denmark. She was betrothed at age 6 and married at 10 to the King of Norway. From a young age, she was immersed in the complex politics of the Scandinavian kingdoms. She learned by watching. She saw how the powerful male nobles and the German merchants of the Hanseatic League constantly interfered in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish affairs, playing the kingdoms against each other. The kings of this era were often ineffective, more interested in feasting and fighting than in statecraft. When her father died, she had her 5-year-old son, Olaf, elected King of Denmark with herself as regent. When her husband died, Olaf inherited the throne of Norway as well. Margaret was now the de facto ruler of 2 kingdoms. She was a woman in a world of powerful men, the Danish and Norwegian councils of nobles, the wealthy Hanseatic merchants, and the ambitious King of Sweden. They all thought they could control her. They were wrong. She proved to be a master politician. She was patient and methodical. She used legal arguments and careful negotiations to regain crown lands that the nobles had taken. She was fiscally brilliant, paying off the kingdom's debts and reforming the currency. The male nobles were used to weak kings they could easily manipulate. They didn't know how to deal with a woman who actually read the financial accounts and understood the law better than they did. Her greatest achievement was the Kalmar Union. The Swedish nobility had rebelled against their unpopular king. They needed a new ruler. Who did they turn to? Margaret. They had seen how well she governed Denmark and Norway. They asked her for help. She orchestrated a brilliant political and military campaign that drove out the old king. In 1397, in the Swedish city of Kalmar, she brought the nobles of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden together. She had them elect her great-nephew Eric as king of all 3 realms. But the document they signed, the Union of Kalmar, made it clear who was really in charge. Margaret. She had united all of Scandinavia under one crown. This was something no Viking warlord or medieval king had ever managed to do. The union she created lasted for over a century. The men she dealt with thought in terms of battles and feudal rights. Margaret thought in terms of unified currency, common foreign policy, and centralized administration. She saw the bigger picture. She was playing chess while they were playing checkers. She ruled for 38 years, bringing peace and stability to a region that had been torn by conflict for centuries. She did it not with an army, but with a superior intellect. Number 10 was Theodora, the real power behind the Byzantine throne. She was the daughter of a bear keeper at the Constantinople Hippodrome. She was an actress, a profession considered scandalous in the 6th century. Yet, she rose to become the most powerful woman in the Byzantine Empire, the co-ruler with her husband, Emperor Justinian I. And there is strong evidence that she was the smarter and tougher of the two. Justinian was a scholar and a legalist. He was intelligent but also indecisive and sometimes prone to panic. Theodora was street smart, courageous, and had an iron will. She understood people and power in a way that Justinian, who had been raised in the palace, did not. The male aristocrats and officials at court were horrified when Justinian announced he would marry her. He even had to change the law to make it possible. They saw her as a disgrace, a woman from the gutter. They never saw her as an intellectual or political equal. They learned their lesson during the Nika riots in 532 AD. A massive riot broke out in Constantinople. The city was in flames. The mob acclaimed a new emperor. Justinian's generals and advisors panicked. They told him the only option was to flee. They had the ships ready. Justinian was about to run. Then Theodora stood up and spoke. She told the assembled men that she was not leaving. She said the royal purple was the noblest shroud. Her speech shamed them. It put steel back into Justinian's spine. He stayed. His general Belisarius took his troops to the Hippodrome and crushed the rebellion. Theodora saved the throne. The men, the seasoned generals and politicians, were ready to give up. The former actress was the one with the courage and the strategic mind to see that flight meant permanent defeat. After that, she was Justinian's full partner in government. Her name appears alongside his in the laws. She had her own court, her own officials, and her own foreign policy. She was particularly interested in social justice. She passed laws that gave more rights to women. She created a home for former prostitutes. She fought against the corruption of officials. Justinian was focused on grand projects like reconquering the Western Roman Empire and codifying Roman law, the famous Code of Justinian. These were important, but Theodora was focused on the practical realities of governing and protecting the vulnerable. She often had a better grasp of politics than her husband. She corresponded with foreign rulers and diplomats. She understood the complex religious debates of the time, such as the conflict between the Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians. While Justinian and his male theological advisors often took a hard, uncompromising line, Theodora sought compromise and reconciliation. She understood that religious unity could not be achieved by force alone. The historian Procopius, who despised her, still couldn't help but document her intelligence and influence. He portrayed her as a manipulative demon, but in doing so, he revealed that she was involved in every major decision of the empire. The men of the court may have looked down on her origins, but they could not deny her intellect. Justinian may have been the emperor, but Theodora was the one who often had the better judgment, the stronger will, and the clearer vision. Number 9. Did Maria Theresa's reforms save the Habsburg Empire? When her father, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, died in 1740, no one expected Maria Theresa to succeed. The Habsburg lands had never been ruled by a woman. Charles had spent years convincing the male rulers of Europe to sign a document, the Pragmatic Sanction, agreeing to her succession. The moment he died, they all broke their promises. The King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, invaded the rich province of Silesia. The Elector of Bavaria, backed by France, invaded and had himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The men around Maria Theresa, her father's old cautious advisors, told her the situation was hopeless. They advised her to give up Silesia, to make concessions, to sue for peace. Maria Theresa was just 23 years old. She had been given no training in statecraft. Her father had prepared her for marriage, not for rule. But she had a powerful mind and an unshakable will. She ignored the timid advice of the men in her council. She went to the Hungarian parliament. Holding her infant son in her arms, she gave a stirring speech, appealing to their honor. The Hungarian nobles, who had often been rebellious, were moved. They pledged their lives and their armies to her cause. This was the start of the War of the Austrian Succession. For 8 years, Maria Theresa fought to hold her empire together. She learned to be a ruler on the job. She studied state papers late into the night. She learned about military strategy and finance. She proved to be a far more capable leader than the male advisors she inherited. They were stuck in the old ways of doing things. She was a pragmatist. After the war, she lost Silesia, but she had saved her empire, and she knew that to survive, the empire had to change. This is where her true intelligence shines. The Habsburg monarchy was a mess. It was a collection of different kingdoms with different laws, taxes, and administration. The army was weak. The treasury was empty, so she started a radical program of reforms. She created a centralized administration. She reformed the tax system, making nobles and clergy pay taxes for the first time. This was a direct challenge to the power of the male aristocracy. She professionalized the army. She created a new military academy. She reformed the legal system. She regulated the relationship between landlords and serfs, providing the peasants with some protection. She was doing the hard, unglamorous work of state building. Her male rival, Frederick the Great of Prussia, was a brilliant general and an intellectual who corresponded with Voltaire. But his reforms were mostly focused on the military. Maria Theresa's reforms were much broader and deeper. She understood that a modern state needed a strong economy, an efficient bureaucracy, and a fair legal system, not just a good army. She was also a mother of 16 children and a devoted wife. She managed to run a vast, complex empire while also running a large family. The men of her court were often amazed by her capacity for work and her attention to detail. She would read and comment on every government report. She made the decisions. Her husband, Francis I, was a capable businessman, but he was not her equal in politics. And her son and co-ruler Joseph II was full of radical Enlightenment ideas, but he was impatient and tactless. Maria Theresa was the one with the practical intelligence to get things done. She saved the Habsburg Empire from collapse and transformed it into a modern state. The men around her thought she would be a weak pawn. She proved to be the strongest piece on the board. Number 8. What did Matilda of Tuscany command that popes and emperors didn't? She was known as the Great Countess. She was a military commander who led her own troops into battle. She was a master of diplomacy who brokered peace between the two most powerful men in Europe, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. She owned a vast territory in northern Italy, and she ruled it for 40 years. Matilda of Tuscany was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, and her power was built on her superior intellect. Matilda lived during the height of the investiture controversy. This was a bitter power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire over who had the right to appoint bishops. It was the central political conflict of the 11th century. The men involved, Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, were proud, stubborn, and willing to plunge Europe into war for their principles. Matilda was a staunch supporter of the Pope, but she was not a blind follower. She was a shrewd political operator. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time. She was fluent in Latin, German, and French. She had a deep knowledge of theology and law. Her library was famous. She understood the legal and theological arguments of the investiture controversy better than many of the knights and nobles who fought in the wars. Her castle at Canossa became the site of one of the most dramatic events of the Middle Ages. In 1077, Emperor Henry IV, who had been excommunicated by the Pope, crossed the Alps in winter to beg for forgiveness. The Pope was staying at Matilda's castle. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates, dressed as a penitent. It was Matilda who mediated the meeting. She was the one who convinced the Pope to forgive the emperor. She was the only person trusted by both of these powerful, arrogant men. Her diplomatic skill and intelligence created a moment of peace, however temporary. But she was more than just a diplomat. She was a ruler. She managed her vast territories with great skill. She founded churches and monasteries. She oversaw the legal system, and when necessary, she led her army. She was a better military strategist than many of her male opponents. She successfully defended her lands against the emperor's armies on multiple occasions. The male nobles of Italy were constantly switching sides, making and breaking alliances for personal gain. Matilda was steadfast. She had a long-term strategic vision. She also played a key role in the revival of Roman law. She supported the legal scholar Irnerius, whose work at Bologna laid the foundation for the first university in Europe. The men fighting for power were focused on the sword. Matilda understood the power of the law. She knew that a society needed rules and institutions to function. She never remarried for love or companionship. Her 2 marriages were political and unhappy. She ruled alone for most of her life. She was a woman in a world of warrior men. They respected her because she could meet them on their own terms on the battlefield. But she defeated them because she had something they lacked, a sophisticated understanding of law, theology, and diplomacy. She ruled a state, commanded an army, and brokered peace between the titans of her age. She was their intellectual superior. Number 7. How did Hatshepsut convince a kingdom that a woman could be a king? She ruled for 22 years, a period of peace and prosperity for Egypt. She built magnificent temples that still stand today. She launched a famous trading expedition to the distant land of Punt. And she did it all as a woman, in a role reserved exclusively for men. Hatshepsut was not just a queen. She declared herself Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Hatshepsut was the daughter of one pharaoh, Thutmose I, and the wife of another, her half-brother Thutmose II. When her husband died, the throne passed to his infant son by another wife, Thutmose III. Hatshepsut became the regent. This was a traditional role for a queen mother, but Hatshepsut was far more ambitious and intelligent than the men of her court expected. The Egyptian court was a complex bureaucracy run by powerful male priests and officials. They were deeply conservative and bound by thousands of years of tradition. The pharaoh had to be a man, a descendant of the male sun god Ra. For a woman to rule as king was unthinkable. Hatshepsut knew she could not rule by force. She had to persuade them, so she launched one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in ancient history. She used her intellect to craft a new identity for herself. She didn't try to change the rule that the pharaoh had to be a man. Instead, she claimed that she was a man, at least for the purposes of kingship. She had herself depicted in statues and reliefs with all the traditional symbols of a male pharaoh. She wore the kilt, the false beard, and the royal headdress. Her inscriptions use male grammar to refer to her. She wasn't hiding her gender. She was arguing that the office of pharaoh was more important than the gender of the person holding it. She also created an elaborate story about her divine birth. She had inscriptions carved at her temple at Deir el-Bahri that told the story of how the god Amun-Ra had taken the form of her father, Thutmose I, and visited her mother. The inscriptions declared that Amun-Ra had personally chosen her to be the ruler of Egypt. How could the male priests of Amun-Ra argue with the will of their own god? It was a brilliant move. She used their own theology against them. While she was building this ideological foundation for her rule, she was also proving she could do the job better than any man. Her reign was not one of military conquest, which was typical for male pharaohs. Instead, she focused on economic prosperity and building projects. She restored trade routes that had been disrupted. Her famous expedition to Punt brought back gold, incense, and exotic animals. This made the country wealthy, and the powerful priests of Amun-Ra happy. She was also a master builder. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is one of the most beautiful buildings in Egypt. It was a massive public works project that employed thousands of people. The men who advised her, like her High Steward Senenmut, were clearly capable, but the vision was hers. She was the one who understood that power came not just from military victory, but from a strong economy, religious legitimacy, and a magnificent building program that glorified both the gods and herself. When she died, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally became pharaoh. He would become one of Egypt's greatest military leaders. Years after her death, he had her name erased from many monuments. For a long time, historians didn't even know she had existed. The men who came after her tried to write her out of history. They could not accept that a woman had been one of their most successful pharaohs. Number 6, could Catherine the Great read Voltaire better than he could read her? She was born a minor German princess named Sophie. She came to Russia at 15 to marry the heir to the throne, the future Peter III. She knew no Russian and was a Lutheran in a deeply Orthodox country. The man she married was immature, foolish, and cruel. The Russian court was a dangerous place, full of intrigue and plots. A lesser woman would have been terrified. Catherine, however, had a secret weapon in her mind. She immediately set about educating herself. She learned the Russian language so well she spoke it with only a slight accent. She devoured books. She read the works of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu. While her husband played with toy soldiers and the male courtiers drank and hunted, Catherine was reading about political theory, law, and philosophy. She was preparing herself to rule. Her husband became emperor in 1762. He ruled for only 6 months. He was deeply unpopular. He alienated the army, the nobility, and the church. Catherine, on the other hand, had spent years building a network of supporters. She was intelligent, charming, and devoutly orthodox. When a coup was launched against Peter, the plotters came to her. She became Catherine II, Empress of all Russia. Her husband was deposed and later killed. The men who put her on the throne, like the Orlov brothers, may have thought she would be their puppet. They were soldiers, not intellectuals. They quickly learned she was no one's puppet. Catherine was in charge. She had a vision for Russia. She wanted to modernize it, to make it a true European power. One of her first major acts was to work on a new legal code, the Nakaz. She wrote much of it herself, drawing heavily on the Enlightenment ideas she had studied. It called for equality before the law and an end to capital punishment. It was so radical that it was banned in France. The old conservative Russian nobles who were supposed to be advising her were baffled by these ideas. They were still living in a feudal world. Catherine was thinking about the rights of man. She famously corresponded with Voltaire for 15 years. They were intellectual equals. She was not just a patron, she was a participant in the great philosophical debates of her time. She bought Diderot's library when he was in financial trouble and paid him a salary to be its librarian. She founded the Hermitage Museum. She established the Smolny Institute, the first state-financed institution of higher education for women in Europe. The powerful men of her court were more concerned with their estates and their military ranks. Catherine was concerned with art, science, and education. She was also a brilliant diplomat and strategist. She greatly expanded the Russian Empire, defeating the Ottoman Empire and partitioning Poland. Her generals like Potemkin and Suvorov were capable men, but the grand strategy was hers. She understood geopolitics. She managed a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The men around her constantly underestimated her, and foreign ambassadors would arrive expecting to deal with a frivolous woman and would leave amazed by her grasp of policy and her sharp intellect. She ruled for 34 years, one of the longest reigns in Russian history. She transformed Russia from a backward, semi-Asiatic state into a major European power. She did it because she had read the books, she had done the work, and she was, quite simply, smarter than the men she had to work with. Number 5. Why did a queen abdicate her throne for a library? She was called the Minerva of the North. She studied for 10 hours a day. She invited the great philosopher René Descartes to her court to be her personal tutor. And then, at the age of 28, she gave it all up. Queen Christine of Sweden abdicated her throne, one of the most powerful in Protestant Europe, and moved to Rome. The reason? She valued knowledge and intellectual freedom more than she valued power. Christina's education was unlike that of any other woman of her time. Her father, the great warrior king, Gustavus Adolphus died in battle when she was 6. Before he left for the war, he ordered that his daughter should be educated exactly like a prince. She learned languages. She was fluent in at least 7: philosophy, theology, mathematics, and military strategy. She was a brilliant student with a voracious appetite for learning. When she came of age, she took control of the government. The male nobles of the Swedish council, led by the powerful chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, expected to guide the young queen. They were experienced statesmen. But they found that Christina had her own ideas. She had read the classics. She understood political theory. She questioned their advice and challenged their assumptions. She worked tirelessly, often sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night. Her court became a magnet for scholars, artists, and musicians from all over Europe. She spent a fortune on books, building one of the greatest libraries in the world. She wanted to make Stockholm the Athens of the North. This was not something the Swedish nobility understood or cared about. They were a military aristocracy. They valued land and honor. They thought her spending on, books and scholars was extravagant and foolish. Her most famous intellectual relationship was with Descartes. She invited him to Sweden in 1649. She insisted on having her philosophy lessons with him at 5 o'clock in the morning in the Cold Castle Library. The harsh Swedish winter and the early hours were too much for the aging philosopher. He caught pneumonia and died within a few months. The story, while tragic, shows Christina's intense dedication to learning, but she grew tired of being a queen. The duties of a Lutheran monarch were restrictive. She was expected to marry and produce an heir. She had no interest in marriage. She was more interested in art, philosophy, and the intellectual life of Catholic Europe. In 1654, she shocked the world by abdicating. She moved to Rome, converted to Catholicism, and established a new court. But it was a court of intellectuals, not courtiers. She became a central figure in the Roman artistic and scientific scene. She founded an intellectual society, the Arcadian Academy. She was a patron to composers like Scarlatti and Corelli. The men who ran the Swedish government back home could not comprehend her decision. To them, giving up a throne was the ultimate failure. For Christina, it was the ultimate liberation. She chose a life of the mind over a life of power. It was a choice that proved her priorities were on a completely different plane from those of the men she had left behind. Number 4, did Elizabeth I's education make her a better ruler than any king? She was the daughter of a king who had her mother executed. She was declared illegitimate and lived for years in the political wilderness. She survived the reigns of her fanatical siblings, one Protestant and one Catholic. When she finally became queen, she inherited a poor, divided country on the edge of civil war. No one expected her to last. She went on to rule for 45 years in what is now called a golden age. The key to her success was her formidable intellect. Elizabeth I received a superb Renaissance education. Her tutor was Roger Ascham, one of the leading scholars in England. By the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in 6 languages: English, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and Greek. She could translate classical texts from Latin and Greek for fun. She was also well versed in history, philosophy, and rhetoric. This was not a decorative education, it was a practical tool for survival and rule. The men who surrounded her at court, nobles like Robert Dudley, William Cecil, and Francis Walsingham, were capable. But none of them had her linguistic skill or her deep understanding of history. When she met with foreign ambassadors, she did not need a translator. She could speak to the French ambassador in flawless French, and the Spanish ambassador in fluent Italian, the language of diplomacy at the time. She could read their secret dispatches in their original languages. This gave her a huge diplomatic advantage. Her male advisors constantly pressured her to marry. They saw an unmarried queen as a weakness. They believed the kingdom needed a king to lead it in war and provide an heir. They paraded a series of foreign princes and English nobles before her. Elizabeth listened to their advice. She flirted. She played for time. But she never married. She famously said she was married to her kingdom. This was not a romantic statement. It was a brilliant political calculation. She knew that marrying a foreign prince would drag England into foreign conflicts. Marrying an English nobleman would create jealousy and factionalism at court. By staying single, she kept all the power for herself. The men in her council, obsessed with marriage and succession, never quite understood that her unmarried state was a source of strength, not weakness. She was also a master of rhetoric and propaganda. Her speeches are masterpieces of political communication. When the Spanish Armada was about to attack in 1588, she went to her troops at Tilbury. The male commanders might have given a simple, brutish speech. Elizabeth gave them poetry and passion. She told them, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She understood how to inspire people. Throughout her long reign, she faced plots, rebellions, and the threat of foreign invasion. The kings of Europe, like Philip II of Spain, consistently underestimated her. They saw her as just a woman, and a heretic at that. They failed to see that she was a brilliant political strategist, a gifted linguist, and a profound student of history. She had learned the lessons of the past. She played her rivals off against each other. She was cautious and pragmatic. While the men around her often urged rash action, she preferred to wait and see. Her intelligence was not just academic, it was a deep, practical wisdom. She outthought, outtalked, and outmaneuvered every man who challenged her. Number 3 was Hypatia of Alexandria, killed for being a woman or for being a genius. She was not a queen, but in the world of ideas, she was royalty. Hypatia of Alexandria was one of the leading mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers of the early 5th century. She was the head of the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, a city that was the intellectual center of the ancient world. She taught a diverse group of students, including Christians and pagans, from all over the Roman Empire. Hypatia's father was Theon, a famous mathematician and astronomer. He gave his daughter the best education possible. He taught her mathematics and science, but also rhetoric and philosophy. This was highly unusual. The education of women in the late Roman Empire was typically focused on domestic arts. Hypatia was educated to be a public intellectual. She quickly surpassed her father. She became a renowned teacher and lecturer. Her lectures were so popular that people crowded to hear her. She would walk through the city in her philosopher's cloak, discussing difficult concepts with anyone who asked. She wrote commentaries on important mathematical texts. She is credited with inventing or improving scientific instruments like the astrolabe and the hydrometer. The men who were her contemporaries and students respected her immensely. One of her students, a Christian bishop named Synesius, wrote letters to her that survive to this day. He addresses her as his master and guide. He asks for her advice on philosophical matters and for her help in constructing scientific instruments. It is clear from his letters that he considered her his intellectual superior, but Hypatia lived in a time of intense religious conflict. The Roman Empire had recently become officially Christian. In Alexandria, the conflict between Christians, Jews, and pagans was escalating. The Christian patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Cyril, was a powerful and ruthless political operator. The Roman governor of the city was a man named Orestes. Orestes was a Christian, but he was also a friend and former student of Hypatia. He often sought her political advice. Cyril and his followers saw Hypatia as a threat. She was a pagan, a woman, and a philosopher who had the ear of the Roman governor. The male leaders of the church saw her as a symbol of the old pagan intellectual world they were trying to destroy. Her intelligence was not seen as a gift, but as a danger. They couldn't defeat her in a debate, so they used violence. In 415 AD, a mob of Christian monks, supporters of Cyril, ambushed Hypatia on her way home. They dragged her from her chariot, took her into a church, and murdered her. Why was she killed? Was it because she was a pagan? Yes. Was it because she was a political ally of Orestes? Yes, but it was also because she was a woman who dared to be the intellectual equal and superior of the most powerful men in her city. She was a public figure, a teacher, a scientist, and a political advisor. In the eyes of the fanatical men who killed her, this was a violation of the natural order. Her intelligence was an affront to their authority. They couldn't silence her ideas, so they silenced her. Her death is often seen as a tragic milestone in the decline of the classical world of reason and the rise of an age of faith and dogma. Number 2, did Empress Theophanu teach the Germans how to be emperors. In the 10th century, the Ottonian Empire, what we now call the Holy Roman Empire, was the most powerful state in Western Europe. It was a world of rough, illiterate warrior dukes. The emperors were German kings who saw themselves as the successors to Charlemagne. And into this world came a princess from the most sophisticated city on earth, Constantinople. Her name was Theophanu. She arrived in 972 to marry the heir to the throne, the future Emperor Otto II. She was a princess of the Byzantine Empire. The German court was probably a huge culture shock for her. The Byzantine court was a center of ancient learning, complex bureaucracy, and refined diplomacy. The German court was a traveling camp of soldiers. The nobles were more comfortable on a horse than in a library. Theophanu was highly educated. She could read and write Greek and Latin. She understood theology, history, and the intricate workings of the Byzantine government. Her husband, Otto II, was educated for a German ruler, but he was no match for his wife's intellect. The German nobles and bishops were suspicious of her. They thought she was haughty and foreign. They nicknamed her the talkative Greek. They didn't appreciate that her talk was the conversation of a highly intelligent and educated person. When Otto II died suddenly in 983, his son Otto III was only 3 years old. The German dukes immediately saw a chance to seize power. The leading contender was Henry the Quarrelsome, Duke of Bavaria. He kidnapped the young Otto III and tried to have himself declared king. It looked like the empire was about to fall apart in a civil war. This is when Theophanu showed her political genius. She formed an alliance with the powerful Archbishop of Mainz. She used her diplomatic skills to win the support of the other German dukes. She was patient and strategic. She outmaneuvered Henry the Quarrelsome at every turn. Within a year, he was forced to return the young king to his mother. Theophanu was recognized as the Empress Regent. For the next 7 years, she ruled the empire. The warrior dukes who had looked down on her were now forced to obey her. And she proved to be a brilliant ruler. She secured the empire's borders. She issued her own charters and diplomas, signing them as Theophanous, by the grace of God, Empress. She managed the complex politics of both Germany and Italy. She also brought a new level of cultural and intellectual sophistication to the German court. She introduced Byzantine art, court ceremonies, and ideas. She was the one who instilled in her son Otto III the grand vision of a renewed Roman Empire, a union of Germany and Italy. Otto III's reign was short, but he was famous for this Ottonian Renaissance. That Renaissance was his mother's legacy. The German nobles she ruled over were men of action, not men of letters. They understood power in terms of land and armies. Theophanu understood power in a more sophisticated way. She knew the importance of legitimacy, diplomacy, and ideology. She saved the empire from collapse and set it on a new course. She was a Byzantine intellectual in a world of German warriors, and she proved that the mind was mightier than the sword. Number 1, why? Was a Mongol queen more enlightened than a French king? In the mid-13th century, King Louis IX of France was one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom. He was a devout Christian, later made a saint. He was also deeply intolerant. He persecuted heretics and passed discriminatory laws against Jews. He saw the world in black and white, Christian and infidel. At the same time, on the other side of the world, the Mongol Empire was being run by a regent, a woman named Sorghaghtani Beki. She was the widow of Jadwiga Khan and the mother of the next great Khan, Gayuk. Like Sorghaghtani Beki, who would later outmaneuver her, Sorghaghtani was a woman ruling in a world of powerful male generals and princes. And her policies were a world away from those of King Louis IX. Sorghaghtani was likely of Nestorian Christian origin, but she presided over an empire that was a melting pot of religions. There were shamanists, Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians all living under Mongol rule. The official Mongol policy established by Genghis Khan was one of religious tolerance. You could believe whatever you wanted as long as you were loyal to the Khan. When Sorghaghtani took power as regent in 1241, she continued this policy. She didn't just tolerate other religions, she actively patronized them. She had Muslim advisors, Christian scribes, and Buddhist monks at her court. She understood something that the King of France did not. A multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire could only be held together by a policy of inclusion, not persecution. The men she had to control, the Mongol princes, were often greedy and ambitious. They were focused on carving out their own territories and enriching themselves. Sorghaghtani had to use all her political intelligence to keep them in line. She used patronage, giving gifts and tax exemptions to her supporters. Her rule was criticized by some Mongol traditionalists as corrupt, but she was holding a vast and fractious empire together during a difficult interregnum. In 1246, she presided over the Kurulti that elected her son Gayuk as the new Great Khan. It was a massive event. A European friar, John of Plano Carpini, was sent by the Pope as an envoy and witnessed it. He was amazed by the wealth and power of the Mongols, and he was amazed to see that the whole thing was being run by a woman. He had come from a world where women, even queens, had limited public power. In the Mongol capital of Karakorum, a woman was in charge of the most powerful empire on earth. Carpini's letter from the Pope asked the Mongols to stop attacking Europe and to convert to Christianity. The reply, written by the new Khan Gayuk, but almost certainly influenced by his mother Sorghaghtani, is a masterpiece of political and intellectual confidence. It doesn't just reject the Pope's demands, it turns them back on him. The letter says that the Mongols are conquering the world on the command of the eternal sky. It asks how the Pope knows who God has chosen. It ends by telling the Pope and the kings of Europe that if they want peace, they should come in person and submit to the Great Khan. This letter shows a worldview that is far more global and self-assured than that of the European rulers of the time. While King Louis IX was focused on the religious purity of his own small kingdom, Sorghaghtani was managing a continent-spanning empire with a policy of pragmatic tolerance. The Mongol princes she ruled were concerned with plunder. The French king she never met was concerned with piety. Sorghaghtani was concerned with the practical business of running a world empire. In her own way, this Mongol queen was more cosmopolitan and intellectually flexible than one of the most celebrated kings of medieval Europe. She understood that diversity was a strength, not a weakness. It was a lesson the men of her time, in both the East and the West, were slow to learn.